Hello everybody, welcome to this webinar about CEN Guide 16, a guide for addressing chemicals and standards for consumer relevant products. This webinar has been pre-recorded and is available on the CEN Senelec website during a few months. We invite you to send all your questions you might have to the email address trainings@censenelec.eu. The webinar will be available for listening until Friday the 30th of August, so please send us your questions by that date. The questions and answers will be made available from the CEN Senelec website. You're also free to share your thoughts and spread the word about this webinar being online via our Twitter channel, Standards for EU.
Hello everyone, my name is Franz Fiala and I have the pleasure to guide you through this short webinar on CEN Guide 16, the guide for addressing chemicals in standards for consumer relevant products. I was one of the project leaders. Let me start by saying a few words about the history of the project. In March 2010, the CEN approach on addressing environmental issues in product and service standards was adopted. It is a general framework to promote and ensure a better inclusion of environmental aspects in European standards. This document contains a clause entitled Tailored Environmental Programs for Technical Bodies, offering the opportunity to develop programs on some specific subjects, such as chemicals in products, which was chosen as a subject to work on. A project team was established consisting of representatives of the standardization bodies from Austria, Denmark, and Spain, and also ECOS was involved, the organization representing environmental interests in standardization. A project proposal was developed and found support by SABE, the Strategic Advisory Body on Environment within CEN. Finally, the Commission agreed to fund the project in December 2014. The project started in January 2015 and ended in June 2017. A stakeholder panel was established to review the output of the project team and to provide advice. It included various stakeholders from the European Commission, from ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, national public authorities, industry, consumer and environmental organizations, and research institutions. The output of the project was the guidance document, the CEN Guide 16, and an associated background information. Both documents can be downloaded free of charge from the CEN website. In addition, an implementation strategy was prepared, which is in the process of being further developed. By product, we mean what is called article in REACH and is defined as follows: an object which during production is given a special shape, surface, or design which determines its function to a greater degree than does its chemical composition. This means that we are not talking about chemical mixtures such as paints or cosmetics. By consumer relevant article, we mean an article which is intended for consumer use, is likely under reasonable foreseeable conditions to be used by consumers, even if not intended for them, or to which consumers may be exposed, for instance in the context of a service. Some consumer relevant articles are excluded from the scope of Guide 16. Electrical and electronic or ICT equipment, simply because this is not in the scope of CEN. Food contact materials, materials used in the supply of drinking water, medical devices, construction products. This is because comprehensive, detailed and specific regulation on chemicals in these products is either already available or subject to consideration and debate. because specific approaches are required, or because performance requirements are supposed to be addressed at the national level, or a combination of all these. Now a few words about using the guide. Of course, everyone who is involved in the development of standards for consumer-relevant articles is invited to have a look at the guide. On the other hand, it is clear that the establishment of chemical provisions is a complex task requiring specialist knowledge, particularly in the fields of chemistry and toxicology. It may be useful to establish specific working groups or task groups composed of experts who have the necessary skills. It should be noted that a broad guide like this can only constitute a starting point for the development of article-specific requirements. It cannot provide article-specific solutions which can be copied and pasted. It is stressed that the technical committee in charge of a certain article is responsible to determine the chemical provisions appropriate for a specific article. And lastly, in some cases, sector-specific guidance documents are already available, and these should be used together with CEN Guide 16. Here you can see the basic structure of the guide. I already talked about the introduction, the scope, the terms and definitions. There is another clause on regulatory, normative and policy background. It's very short. It refers to the background information document, which contains much more comprehensive information on the subject. There is a short clause about chemical safety assessment or chemical risk assessment, and again, more comprehensive information can be found in the background document. Clause 5 is the centerpiece of the guide, and we'll come back to that in a few seconds. There is another clause on information provision concerning chemicals in articles. Annex A contains a list of all the recommendations that you can find throughout the document in gray boxes. And lastly, there is a biography. Now let's have a closer look at Clause 5, which I said is at the heart of the guide. The first 6 clauses are dealing with groups of substances in a more generic fashion without looking at specific substances. By contrast, the clauses 5.7 to 5.16 are looking at specific substances which fall in any of the categories elements, metals, flame retardants, colorants, primary aromatic amines, monomers, plasticizers, solvents, volatile organic compounds, and others. Lastly, there is one clause dealing with other aspects not related to chemical safety assessment, such as color fastness or sensory evaluation, which can be found in various specifications. Now let us look at some examples. For instance, there is a clause on substances of very high concern. These are substances which are included in Annex 14 of REACH and are not allowed to be used in Europe after a certain date, unless the manufacturer gets a specific authorization for a certain purpose. These rules do, however, not exclude that such substances can be found in imported articles. Therefore, it seems to be useful to have a generic exclusion of such substances in consumer-relevant articles using a threshold of 0.1%. Nevertheless, it is necessary to check whether for certain substances a lower threshold should be set. The clause on CMR substances is another example for recommended generic exclusions. CMR substances are substances which are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic for reproduction. It is recommended to follow the approach of the Toy Safety Directive, excluding CMR substances using different thresholds depending on the category of the CMR substance. It must be stressed again that for certain substances, lower thresholds may be warranted, in particular for those substances where a threshold cannot be determined. Now let's move on to specific substances, to recommendations for substances which are often included in substance groups. These clauses follow a general structure. In the first part, REACH restrictions for consumer-relevant articles are dealt with. These are substances which are included in Annex 17 of REACH. In the next part, other regulatory provisions and related standards are covered, dealing, for instance, with persistent organic pollutants, with toys, packaging, and so forth. In the third part, voluntary specifications are dealt with, for instance, rules included in the Ecotex 100 standard or in the European Eco-label. And lastly, there is a section including remarks with recommendations. Due to time constraints, we can look only at one substance group, flame retardants. And in this clause, we recommend to consider the exclusion of flame retardants which are not accepted in the Ecotex 100 standard and the leather standard by Ecotex, or voluntary instruments such as the EU Eco-label criteria. We also consider alternative options, for instance, to develop a positive list of substances which are allowed to be used. A further alternative would be to exclude flame retardants which are only physically mixed to the matrix or material and accept only reactive flame retardants which cannot so easily migrate from the material. And another alternative would be to require materials which are inherently non-combustible or materials with reduced flammability. A final remark: the publication of CEN Guide 16 was not the end of the story. Actually, it was the beginning. We are considering measures to facilitate the implementation of the guide, and we are looking forward to fruitful discussions with all technical committees concerned.
Thank you for having followed this webinar until the end. The webinar has been pre-recorded, so we invite you to send all your questions that you might have to the email address trainings@censenelec.eu. We will collect all questions and make them available together with the answers via the CEN website. The deadline for sending in your questions is the 30th of August 2019. We would also be happy if you share your thoughts and ideas on Twitter by using our handle @standards4EU.